"What's next?" asked Patches as the last calf escaped through the gate when he had just opened, and ran to find the waiting and anxious mother. Phil looked at his companion and laughed. Honourable Patches showed the effect of his strenuous and bulging efforts to learn the rudimentary of the apparent simple trick of roping a calf. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, his hair was dishevelled and his clothes soiled and stained, but his eyes were bright, and his bearing eager and ready. "What's the matter?" he demanded, grinning happily at his teacher. "What fool thing have I done now?" "Oh, you're doing fine," returned Phil, wondering. "I was only thinking that you don't look much like the man I met up there on the divide that evening." "I don't feel much like him either, as far as that goes," returned Patches. Phil glanced up at the sun. "What do you say to dinner? Must be about that time." "Dinner? Sure. I brought some jerky there on my saddle and some coffee. There ought to be an old pot in the shack yonder. Some of the boys don't bother, but I never like to miss a feed when it's necessary." He did not explain that the dinner was really a thoughtful concession to his own companion. "Oh," ejected Patches with a shrug of disgust. The work they'd been doing was still fresh in his mind. "I couldn't eat a bite." "Oh, you think that now," retorted Phil, "but you just go down to the crick and drink all you can hold and wash up, and see how quick you'll change your mind when you smell the coffee." And thus Patches received yet another lesson. A lesson in the art of forgetting promptly the most disagreeable features of his work, an art very necessary to those who aspire to master real work of any sort whatsoever. When they finished their simple meal and lay stretched full length beneath the overhanging limbs of the age-old tree that had witnessed many stirring scenes, and listened to so many campfire tales of ranch and range, they talked of things other than their work, in low tones, as men who feel a mystic and not to be explained bond of fellowship, with half-closed eyes, looked out into the untamed world that lay before them. They spoke of life, of its mystery and meaning, and Phil, usually so silent when any conversation touched himself, and so timid always in expressing his own self-thoughts, was strangely moved to permit this man to look upon the carefully hidden and deeper things of his own life. But upon his cherished dream, upon his great ambition, he kept the door closed fast. The time for that revelation of himself was not yet. "By the way, Phil," said Patches, when at last his companions signified it was time for them to go, "where were you educated? I don't think I've ever heard you say." "I have no education," returned the young man with a laugh that to Patches sounded a bitter note. "I'm just a common cow-puncher, that's all." I beg your pardon," returned the other, "but I thought from the books that you mentioned." "Oh, the books. Why, you see, some 4 years ago, a real honest-to-goodness bookman came out to this country for his health, and brought his disease along with him." "His disease?" questioned Patches. Phil smiled. "His books, I mean. They killed him, and I fell heir to their trouble. He was a good fellow, all right. We all liked him. Might have been a man if he hadn't been so much of a scholar. I was curious at first just to see what it was that had such a grip upon him, and then I got interested in myself. About that time, too, there was a reason why I thought it might be a good thing for me, so I sent for more, and have made a fairly good job of it the past 3 years. I don't think there's any danger, though, of the habit getting the grip on me that it had on him," he reflected with a whimsical grin. "It was our book friend who first called, Uncle Will the Dean." "The title certainly fits him well," remarked Patches. "I don't wonder that it struck. I suppose you received yours from your riding?" "Mine? Wild Horse Phil, I mean," smiled the other. Phil laughed. "Haven't you heard that yarn yet? I reckon I may as well tell you. No, wait. he explained eagerly. "We got lots of time. We'll ride south a little ways, and perhaps I can show you." As they rode away up the creek, Patches wondered much as his companion words as his manner, but the cowboy shook his head at every question, answering simply, "Wait." Soon they left the creek bed, passing through a rock gateway at the beginning of a little stream, and where, riding up a long, gently sloped hollow between two low and rugged ridges, the crest of the rocky wall on their left was somewhat higher than the ridge on their right. But as the floor of the long, narrow hollow ascended, the sides of the little valley became correspondingly lower. Patches noticed that his companion was already keenly alert and watchful. He sat his horse easily, but there was a certain air of readiness in his pose, as though he was anticipating sudden action, while his eyes searched the mountain sides with eager expectation. They had nearly reached the upper end of the long slope when Phil abruptly reined his horse to the left and rode straight up that rugged, rock-strewn mountain wall. To Patches it seemed impossible that a horse could climb such a place, but he said nothing and wisely gave Snip his head. They were nearly at the top, so near, in fact, that Phil could see over the narrow crest when the cowboy suddenly checked his horse and slipped from the saddle. With a gesture, he bade his companion follow his example, and in a moment Patches stood beside him. Leaving their horses, they crept the last remaining feet to the summit. Crouching low, then laying prone, they worked their way to the top of a huge rounded rock, from which they looked over and down upon the country that lays beyond. Patches uttered a low exclamation, but Phil's instant grip on his arm checked further speech. From where they lay, they looked down upon a great mountain basin of gentle, rolling native grass. From the foot of that rocky ridge, the beautiful pasture stretched away several miles to the bold grey cliffs and mighty tower battlements of Granite Mountain. On the south, a range of dark hills; to the north, a series of sharp peaks that formed the natural boundaries. "Do you see them?" whispered Phil. Patches looked at him inquiringly. The stranger's interest in the wonderful scene that led him to overlook that which held his companion's attention. "Over there," whispered Phil impatiently. "On the side of that hill there. They're not more than 400 yards away, and they're working towards us." "Do you mean those horses?" whispered Patches, amazed by his companion's manner. Phil nodded. "Do those belong to the Cross Triangle?" asked Patches, still mystified. "The Cross Triangle?" Phil chuckled. Then, with a note of genuine reverence in his voice, he added softly, "They belong to God, Mr. Honorable Patches." Then Patches understood. "Wild horses!" he ejected softly. There are few men, I think, who can look without admiration upon a beautifully formed, noble-spirited horse. The glorious pride and strength and courage of these most kindly of God's creatures, even when they're in harness and subject to their often inferior masters, compel respect and a degree of appreciation. But seen as they roam free in those pastures that, since creation, have never been marred by plough or fence, pastures that are theirs by divine right, and the sunny slopes and shady groves and rocky nooks of which consternate their kingdom, where in their lordly strength they're subject only to the dictates of their own being, and unmutilated by human cruelty, ruled by the power and authority of nature's law. They stir the blood of the coldest heart to a quicker flow, and thrill the mind of the dullest with admiring awe. "There's 28 in that bunch," whispered Phil. "You see that big black stallion on guard? The one that throws up his head every minute or two to have a look around?" Patches nodded. There was no mistaking the watchful leader in the band. "He's the chap that gave me my title, as you might call it," chuckled Phil. "Come on now, we'll go see them in action, then I'll tell you about it." He slipped from the rock and led the way back to the saddle horses. Riding along the ridge, just under the crest, they soon reached the point where the chain of low peaks merged into the hills that formed the southern boundary of the basin, and so suddenly came into full view of the wild horses that were feeding on the slopes a little below. As the horsemen appeared, the leader of the band threw up his head with a warning call to his fellows. Phil reined in his horse and motioned for Patches to do the same. For several minutes, the black stallion held his place, as motionless as the very rocks of the mountainside, gazing straight at the mounted men as though challenging their right to cross the boundaries of his kingdom, while his retainers stood as still, waiting his leadership. With his long black mane and tail rippling and waving in the breeze that swept down from Briar Pass and across the basin, with his raven black coat glistening in the sunlight with the sheen of richest satin, where the swelling muscles curved and rounded from the shadows to the high light, and with his pose a perfect strength of freedom, he looked, as he was, a prince of his kind, a lord of the untamed life that homes in these God-cultivated fields. Patches glanced at his companion, as if to speak, but struck by the expression on the cowboy's face, remained silent. Phil was leaning a little forward in his saddle, his body as perfect in its poise of alert and graceful strength as the body of the wild horse at which he was gazing with such fixed interest. The clear, deeply tanned skin of his cheeks glowed warmly with the red of his clean, rich blood. His eyes shone with suppressed excitement. His lips, slightly parted, curved into a smile of appreciation, love, and reverence for the unspoiled beauty of wild creature that he himself, in so many ways, unconsciously resembled. And Patches, bred and schooled in a world so far from this world of primitive things, looked from Phil to the wild horse and back again, from the stallion to the man, felt the spirit and the power that made them kin, felt it with, to him, strange new feeling of reverence, as though in the first unspoiled, perfect life strength of man and horse he came into a closer touch with the divine that he'd ever known before. Then, without taking his eyes from the object of his almost worship, Phil said, "Now watch him, Patches, watch him." As he spoke, he moved slowly towards the band, while Patches rode close by his side. At their movement, the wild stallion called another warning to his followers, and went a few graceful steps towards the slowly approaching men. And then, as they continued their slow advance, he whirled with smooth grace of a swallow, and with a movement so light and free that he seemed rather to skim over the surface of the earth than tread upon it, circled here and there about his band, assembling them in closer order, flying with ears flat and teeth bared and mane and tail tossing, in lordly fury at the laggards, driving them before him, but keeping always between his charges and the danger until they were evidently judged to be, for their inferior strength, a distance of safety. And then again he halted his company, and moved alone a short ways towards the horsemen, stood motionless, and watched their slow approach. Again Phil checked his horse. "God," he exclaimed under his breath, "what a sight! Oh, you beauty, you're a beauty." But Patches had moved less by the royal beauty of the wild stallion than by the passionate reverence that reverberated from his companion's voice. Again the horsemen moved forward, and again the stallion drove his band to a safe distance and stood waiting between them and their enemies. Then the cowboy laughed aloud, a hearty laugh of clean enjoyment. "All right, old fella, I'll just give you a whirl of luck," he said aloud to the wild horse, apparently forgetting his human companion. And Patches saw him shorten his reins and rise a little in his stirrups, while his horse, as though understanding, gathered himself for a spring. In a flash, Patches was alone, watching as Phil, riding with every ounce of strength that his mount could command, dashing straight towards the band. For a moment The black stallion stood watching the now rapidly approaching rider. Then wheeling, he started his band, driving them imperviously now to an utmost speed. And then, as though he understood this new maneuver of the cowboy, he swept past the running companions and with the clean, easy flight of an arrow, and taking his place at the head of this charge, led them away towards Granite Mountain. Phil stopped, and Patches could see him watching as the wild horses, with streaming manes and tails, followed their leader, who seemed to run with less than half the strength, swept away across the rolling hillside, growing smaller and smaller in the distance until, as dark, swiftly moving dots, they vanished over the skyline. "Wasn't that great?" cried Phil when he had loped back to his companion. "Did you see 'em go by the bunch like they were standing still?" "There didn't seem to be much show for you to catch 'em," said Patches. "Catch 'em!" exclaimed Phil. "Do you think I was trying to catch 'em? I just wanted to see 'em go. The horse doesn't live that could put a man within roping distance of any one in that bunch on a straightaway run, and the black could run circles around the whole outfit. I had 'em once, though." "You caught that black?" explained Patches incredulously. Phil grinned. "I sure had him for a little while." "What is he doing out here running loose then?" demanded the other. "Got away, did he?" "Got away nothing. Fact is, he belongs to me right now, in a way, and I wouldn't swap him for any string of cow horses that I ever saw." Then, as they rode towards the home ranch, Phil told the story that is known throughout all the country. "It was when that black was a yearling," he said. "I'd had my eye on him all year, and so had some of the other boys who had sighted the band. For you could see, even when he was a colt, he was going to be something. The wild horses were getting rather too numerous that season, and we planned a chase to thin them out a little, as we do every 2 or 3 years. Of course, everyone was after the black, and one day, along towards the end of the chase, when the different bands had been broken up and scattered plenty much, I run upon him. I was trailing old Gray up that draw, the way we came in today, you know, and all at once I met him as he was coming over the top of the hill right where you and I rode on to him. It was all so sudden that for a minute he was rattled as bad as me, and believe me, I was shaking like a leaf. I managed to come to first, though, and hung my rope on him before he could get started. I don't know to this day where the old Gray that I was after went. Well, sir, he fought like a devil, and for a spell we had it around and around until I wasn't dead sure whether I had him or he had me. But he was only a yearling then, you see, and I finally got him down." Phil paused, a particular expression on his face, and Patches waited silently. "Do you know," said the cowboy at last, hesitating, "I can't explain it, and I don't talk about it much, for it was the strangest thing that ever happened to me, but when I looked into that black stallion's eyes, and he looked me straight in the face, I never felt so sorry for anything in my life. I was sort of ashamed, like I'd been caught holding up a church, you know, or something like that. We were all alone up there, just him and me, and while I was getting my wind and we were sizing each other up, I was feeling that way. I got to thinking what it all meant to him to be broken and educated and, well, civilized, you know. I thought what a horse he'd be if he was left alone to live as God made him, and so, well..." He paused again with an embarrassed laugh. "You let him go?" cried Patches. "It's the God's truth, Patches. I couldn't do anything else. I just couldn't. One of the boys came up just in time to catch me turning him loose, and of course the whole outfit just naturally raised hell about it. You see, in a chase like that, we always bunch 'em all and sell 'em off to the highest bidder, and every man in the outfit shares alike. The cowboys figured the black was worth more than any 5 others they'd caught, so I couldn't blame them for feeling sore. but I fixed it with them by turning all my share into the pot so they couldn't kick. That, you see, makes the black belong to me in a way, and it's pretty well generally understood that I propose to take care of 'em. There was a fellow riding in the rodeo last fall that took a shot at him one day, and well, he left the country right after it happened, and hasn't been seen around here since." The cowboy grinned at his companion as he laughed out. "Do you know," Phil continued in a low tone a few minutes later, "I believe that horse knows me yet. Whenever I'm over in that part of the country, I always have a look at him if he happens to be around, and we visit a little, as we did today. I got a funny notion that he likes it as much as I do, and I can't tell how it is, but it sort of makes me feel good all over just to see him. I reckon you think me some kind of fool, though." He finished with another short laugh of embarrassment. "But that's the way I feel, and that's why they call me Wild Horse Phil." For a little they rode in silence, and then Patches spoke gravely. "I don't know how to tell you what I think, Phil, but I understand, and from the bottom of my heart I envy you." And the cowboy, looking at his companion, saw in the man's eyes something that reminded him of that which he had seen in the wild horse's eyes that day when he had set him free. Had Patches, too, at some time in those days that had gone, had been caught by the riata of a circumstance or environment, or in some degree robbed of his God inheritance? Phil smiled at the fancy, but smiled, felt its truth. With a genuine sympathy felt it also to be true that this man might yet, by the strength that was deepest within him, regain that which he had lost. And so that day, as the man from the ranges and the man from the cities rode together, the feeling of kinship that each had instinctively recognized at their first meeting on the divide was strengthened. They knew that a mutual understanding which could not have been put into words or if any tongue or land had drawn them closer together. A few days later, the incident occurred that fixed their friendship, as they thought, for all time to come. End of chapter 8.